Welcome to All Home Care Matters, the show where we discuss all things home care, with discussions on important age-related matters and topics. Brought to you by Enriched Life Home Care Services, the #1 rated home care provider in Michigan by Top Rated Local.
Hello, and welcome back to All Home Care Matters. If this is your first time visiting us here at the show, we want to say thank you for taking time out to be with us today. We appreciate how valuable everyone's time is, and that's why we try and make each episode here at All Home Care Matters something that will hopefully matter to you. Today, I am honored to welcome Sarah Cart. Sarah is the author of the book, On My Way Back to You. Welcome, Sarah. How are you?
I am well, Lance. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure, Sarah. So I introduced you as the author of On My Way Back to You, and we'll get into it here during the interview, but tell me about the title, On My Way Back to You. That, if I heard that, I could come up with several different maybe situations, but yours is very specific. Tell us how you come to name the book that.
It's an expression that my husband and I have abbreviated, my husband, Ben. We've abbreviated it. It's the way we respond to each other when one of us is out doing errands. Hey, are you stopping at the post office on the way back? No, I'm on my way back to you.
Oh.
And the abbreviation is OMB. I don't know, my phone recognizes it, so I just put in OMW and it fills in the rest.
Wonderful. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a personal thing, it's not just a general statement. It's an inside.
Yeah, it's a personal text speak.
And your book is really written in a memoir format.
Yes.
What made you write a memoir about your situation?
It was a way to process everything that we had been through. Ben was diagnosed with an incurable autoimmune disease, and we were told it would be manageable symptom by symptom, and we were on top of that until we weren't. It migrated from organ to organ and diagnosis to diagnosis and medication to medication, and eventually it got to his heart. We got him a pacemaker. 9 months later, it was obvious the pacemaker wasn't going to be able to keep up with his problems, and the shortest version is 2 weeks after the world was shut down with the pandemic, he ended up in the hospital in kidney failure. Needing a heart transplant. Wow. So, and after all was said and done, his recovery was more challenging than anyone had expected. And anyway, after everything was said and done, I needed to go back and figure out what just happened.
Yeah.
So,
what you said he was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. What's the name?
It's called systemic sclerosis. So I don't know enough about multiple sclerosis. What I've learned is that sclerosis means hardening. Right. And systemic sclerosis typically presents with a hardening of the skin, which is actually its own disease called scleroderma. Ben's was diagnosed before that really began. So he was on medication right away. So he didn't really have the skin issues that many people have with it. Mm-hmm. But his presented with slightly swollen fingers, and then a little bit of Raynaud's syndrome, which is when your fingers change color as the temperature changes. And I asked him about it. I nagged him about it, and then I ratted him out to our GP when we went to get our flu shots. And our GP said, "We're not giving him the flu shot today. We'll do blood work instead." So we were lucky to have diagnosed it early on.
Did Ben really notice anything other than like those subtle changes? Like, had he noticed maybe weeks, months before you kind of ratted him out and he was keeping it from you, or?
Yeah, I wouldn't say he was keeping it from me, but it was one of those conversations where you ask your partner of many decades, "So how long has this been going on?" And when he says a couple of weeks, he means a couple of months. Okay. And it was also coming into cold weather. So I think he thought maybe it was just that the seasons were changing and the weather was getting colder because we were still up north. Yeah. And I think he thought it would disappear when we got to Florida, which didn't happen.
What initiated you wanting to write this book? Was it more therapeutic, or was it more helping others, or was it a little bit of both, or something else?
It was a little of both. When I'm stressed, I journal. And so I had journaled a lot as Ben got sicker. So I had a lot of notes. I also had a lot of notes from all of his doctor's appointments. And when he ended up in the hospital during COVID, which was a 10-week time when I couldn't see him, he went in, he was dying when he went in, and somehow miraculously he got on the list for transplant. He then was so unstable, he was removed from the list for transplant, and then they put him back on again, and they were about to take him off when a heart was allocated. Um, Through all of that, I was trying very hard to keep close family and friends on the same page. So I was sending out emails every other day, sometimes a couple of times a day as things got tense. And so I had those emails already. And when I write those emails and when I write in my journal, if I'm coming with a problem or a challenge, I try to open with the challenge, and by the end of it, have it be a more positive, or as positive as can be under the circumstances, closing. So that collection of emails told the story, and it was the beginnings of the book. Those emails were the outline for the beginnings of the book.
Yeah, I thought when I was reading through the book, I thought that was interesting. You don't see that often where people are including emails, like, as kind of reference points. I thought that was really a great approach to really take it into the actual in the moment kind of where things were at. Did you initially decide to do the book then when you were going through the COVID and the heart transplant, or was this like when you kind of got past a lot of these things? Like, when did you say, you know what, I'm going to go from journaling and we're going to put this all into a book format?
I think it was about 9 months after the heart transplant, so early the following year. He got his transplant in April of 2020, and I think it was probably the long days of January 2021 as COVID was still kind of continuing. And now that he was home and he was doing so much better and my caregiving duties were easing up somewhat, it was, okay, now what am I going to do with my time? And again, like I said, I needed to process everything we'd been through.
When
So,
when COVID hit, and I know, speaking professionally, so many families that we help or that we helped as a result of, that was some of the darkest days of their lives. And they're not dealing necessarily all of them with magnitude of issues like you were and Ben were, but mom or grandpa or dad, they're in a nursing home, they're in a hospital, and
yeah.
some were at their end of life, some were in there for routine things, whatnot. But the family's scared, their loved one is scared, but they were not allowed to go in to visit. You could look through a window, but if you're on the second floor or up, that doesn't really do anything. How were you managing that with a heart transplant and all these things? And I'm assuming the same applied where you guys are at. Were you allowed to go in to the hospital?
Right.
No.
Yeah. So walk me through
He
what
ended up in
happened.
the hospital because his kidneys were failing. It was literally 2 weeks to the day after the pandemic was declared. In the late afternoon, our doctor called our GP because he'd just seen some blood work that was done for a different doctor.
Mhm.
And the different doctor had probably already seen the blood work as well, but he was looking for something totally different. He was looking to see how Ben was doing with a particular infection. Our doctor looked at it and realized that Ben's kidneys were crashing. So he calls in the late afternoon and says, Ben needs to see a doctor right now.
Yeah.
And Ben picked up the extension. We were on a landline, and Ben picked up the extension and was like, well, hey, if you're going to be in the office tomorrow, because our doctor did have Saturday hours, I'll come. You can draw blood. I'll pee in a cup for you, whatever you need. And the GP said, no, you need to be in an ER right now. And I had been in the hospital 3 weeks earlier having herniated a disc, so I wasn't allowed to drive anywhere. And the doctor knew that. And he said, I'm just going to arrange for an ambulance. And Ben said, well, let me call a guy who's been driving me to my doctor's appointments since Sarah got sick. and see if he can take me. And that's what happened. So Lamar showed up in his big black Suburban, and I really thought Ben was going away for the weekend. I think Ben thought he was going away for the weekend. And he came home 10 weeks later. How we kept in touch. Early on, it was easy. He had his phone, he had his iPad, I had my computer. My first Zoom call was actually that night after he went to the hospital. And for me now, to think of life without Zoom is like trying to remember what it was like before I knew how to read. It's just such a part of day-to-day life anymore. But then as his numbers got worse and his mental abilities diminished, he couldn't coordinate the phone. And so we were dependent on the nurses to start FaceTimes for us, maybe even to hold his phone or his iPad for us. It got really challenging. And as he got sicker, and by the time he had the heart transplant, he was totally out for several days. So the nurses would call me and update me on things. The doctors would call and update me on things. And then 7 days after the heart transplant, one of the doctors called and said, "Has anyone mentioned this broken left hip?" Which was a whole nother dimension to everything we were going through. So when he came home to me after 10 weeks away, 8 of which was in the hospital, 2 of which was in rehab, he was in a wheelchair and unable to walk. He could shuffle, it's like 8 steps with a walker, but basically 99% of the time he was in the wheelchair. So it was, communicating with him was challenging the whole way along.
When he came home in the wheelchair, I mean, is your house equipped to have a wheelchair in and out of? I mean, that's a whole nother dimension also.
That is a whole nother dimension. As he was getting sicker before he ended up in the hospital, we had recognized that doing stairs was really challenging for him. And we had actually moved into a house that was handicap accessible. I never expected that I would be the first one who needed it. When I came home from the hospital after my back, I was very glad to have the ramp from the garage and the elevator to the second floor. So we were lucky that way. We'd done it in an optimistic hope that he wasn't dying, that this autoimmune, we were going to get a grip on whatever it was that was challenging him about going up and down the stairs. We were going to get a grip on his heart and his kidneys and the other infections he had going on. And we needed a handicap accessible house. So we had already done that.
That's wonderful. So many times, people, they wait until the need arises, then they try to make that change or adjustment, and it just adds to the, the pressure and the stress and everything else that you're already going through.
Yeah, I don't know if you'd call it a benefit. We had the benefit of watching his parents and my father and stepmother make those mistakes,
Sure.
if you want to call them mistakes. And so we were a little bit more proactive than we might have been otherwise.
Oh, that's wonderful. When you were talking about, with your back surgery and, recovering from that, aside from that situation, Sarah, how were you taking care of yourself? It sounds like you were kind of a one-person show taking care of Ben. How were you managing? And I'm asking this because I think our viewers and listeners can maybe pick up some pointers or take some sage advice from you who has been there and done that. And they may be in the very early stages of their journey. I'm sure it didn't start off that way necessarily, but as you were, evolving through taking care of Ben and being his caregiver, how did you start learning or managing to get that self-care and taking care of yourself and making your own health a priority? How did you juggle that?
Well, I've mentioned journaling, and I also, I would say I'm a walking addict. If I don't get some steps in, I can get really antsy and itchy. And a lot of my, as a writer, a lot of my work gets done while I'm letting things percolate, doesn't necessarily get done at the computer. So walking is a way that I percolate. And then when Ben went into the hospital, a lot of people knew how sick he was, just how sick he had been that winter, and a lot of people had been in touch, and we had said, he's doing well. When he's doing well, we can take things a week at a time. When he's not doing quite as well, we take things a day at a time. Sometimes we have to take things an hour at a time. And in the meantime, we have a roof over our heads and the larder is full, so we're counting our blessings. But as things got a little bit more ramped up, a friend sent me a link for a 3-week meditation series that Oprah Winfrey and Deepak Chopra had put out at the beginning of the pandemic as a gift to the world. And that was nice that she sent me that email, but I was a little bit too crazed, a little bit too busy to do anything with it until after Ben was out of the house. And suddenly it was just me and our dog. And I clicked on the first day of that. And at the end of 20 minutes, I think the message the first time was, the power of hope is real. And after 20 minutes of meditating on that, I felt lighter somehow. And I made a point of finding the time. Sometimes I had to fit it in with a crowbar, but making the time each day to do that. And then there were other meditation series that they offered as well that I followed up with. That was really, really helpful. And breathing exercises. I had learned about breathing exercises a few years earlier, and I found that I was doing them if I'd wake up in the middle of the night and was obsessing about something. The one that worked best for me would be to exhale as if my lungs were a sponge, just as far as tight as I could, all the bad, doubt, frustration, anger, grief. And as soon as I needed to inhale again, I'd try to inhale joy, gratitude, open-mindedness, confidence, strength, and whatever positive words I could think. And in the middle of the night, I'd only need to do that about 3 times, exhaling the bad stuff and inhaling the good, before I'd finally go back to sleep. And I tried to do that also in the midst of stressful days, when something really wiped me out or stunned me with, oh no, wait a minute, how are we going to handle that? If I could step back and count 10. I mean, literally, the stuff you probably heard about in kindergarten, but didn't really realize, oh, this is when you really need that. Those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So,
I don't know if you've thought this yourself or if ever been asked this, but, we all go through experiences and journeys, trials, successes, tribulations, whatever you want to call it. And you stop and you think, if I'd only known this, or if I'd only done that after, you're removed from the situation, what would be something that Sarah today would go back and tell Sarah from back then?
I used to think it was, you are stronger than you think, but there's some judgment in that. Some challenge of, you need to be strong.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that. It's more, you are going to get through this. It may be 1 weak step forward at a time. It may be 3 weak steps backwards at a time, twice in a row, 5 times in a row. But if you can just keep pushing forward gently, and then when you have the opportunity, with a little bit more energy, you are going to get through this. Be forgiving of yourself. This is new. It's not something you're supposed to do perfectly. So ask for help.
Yeah.
Accept help when it's offered. Be generous with people who offer help or make comments that sound awkward or that don't come out right, that they don't know what they're doing either, but they're trying to be helpful.
Great point.
And I was going someplace else with that and just lost it. Generous with yourself. I can't remember. Sorry.
That's okay. If you think of it, let us know. But kind of staying on that same path, oh, you got it?
I got it.
Go ahead.
I got it.
Yeah.
When people ask how things are going, be honest.
Yeah.
Don't exaggerate. but don't sugarcoat it either. You don't want to have to walk it back if things turn south
Right.
at a later date. So,
And one that I'm fond of adding is when people offer to help, let them help. And it kind of
yes.
goes to what you're saying, don't sugarcoat it and say, "Oh, I don't need it." Because more people than not, when they ask, they genuinely want to see how they can help you. And it doesn't mean, coming and sitting with your loved one necessarily, but maybe you need to get the car's oil change, or maybe you need help getting, kids picked up from school or grocery, whatever it is. I tell people, make a list, and keep that list with
Yes.
you.
And then,
Someone said that to me the other day, and I thought, wow, I have a list all the time, but it didn't occur to me to
right.
look at my list and say,
But,
you could
and
just
that,
go fill the car with gas.
Absolutely. And that's the thing,
Yeah.
when you're in the middle of it, you have so many other things going around in your head and that you're taking care of, and you're multitasking and thinking of the next thing you got to get done. You don't often think of it. That's why, just having that list and keeping it handy, because I tell people, like with families we help, Sarah, the son might to the daughter, the daughter and son, the daughter might think her brother's not helping or doing anything, but maybe the brother's not comfortable bathing or helping mom use the restroom. But
Right.
brother would be great at coordinating delivery of groceries or setting up appointments or getting the prescriptions refilled. There's always usually something that somebody would be comfortable with doing, but you have to let them know of what they can do, and just having that list can sometimes make all the difference in the world.
Yeah, and you have to have a list that has a wide variety of stuff on it
exactly.
that can
Yeah.
accommodate what people are offering to do.
Yes, absolutely.
I want to talk too about, because I wouldn't say you're in your golden years, right? You guys were younger, still are younger, Sarah. And, not all couples go through these types of situations at that stages in their life. And most of them don't plan on it either. Like I'm sure you and Ben hadn't. What advice would you give to couples or any family with a dynamic of any age group experiencing some sort of health crisis? What would you recommend to them?
Um, well, you're more prepared for it than you realize if you've raised a family. You've been juggling things for years. You're now just going to be juggling different stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and we need to talk more about caregiving as a society because there's a great quote from First Lady Rosalind Carter, which you probably know about. There are four kinds of people in the world. Yeah. Those who have been caregivers, those who are caregivers, those who will be, or those who will need them. And we don't prepare for it the way we prepare for a wedding. Or, for example, now we prepare for weddings for years ahead of time. And that's just a day.
Yeah.
Caregiving can be years.
Yeah.
And you kind of need to brace yourself for it. And hopefully you will be much better prepared for it than you ever need to be. But it needs to be on more than on your horizon. It needs to be something that you are aware of and in tune about. Another thought that I had was about when we went into all of this. I'm a perfectionist. It doesn't show now. I'm in an unironed shirt and a dusty table behind me, but and I didn't express my perfectionism by ironing or dusting, but sometimes good enough is good enough.
Right.
And one of the lessons that I learned through Ben's being so sick, when they called and said his hip was broken, they were afraid that it had happened on their watch. It had not. It had happened on mine. It happened right before he went into the hospital, but we didn't know it. He was sleeping so badly at that point that, he was just restless all the time and maybe getting 10 minutes of real sleep out of every 24 hours. So he got up in the middle of the night. At this point, he's sleeping on the couch because he was afraid of falling out of bed and the couch was closer to the floor. And he got up in the middle of the night to go use the bathroom, which was maybe 8 feet from the couch. And on the way back, he fell asleep and fell over.
Wow.
Like a tree in the forest. I did not hear him because I was also exhausted. So I'm in the next room and I'm asleep. But I noticed the next day or the day after that, why are you taking so much ibuprofen? And, oh, I hurt my hip. What did you do? Well, I fell on my way back from the bathroom. Ooh, wow, did you hit the table? No, I just went straight over and it's a little bruised. And that was it. That was all we had said about it. But for me, as a perfectionist, that was a fail. How did I not know that? If we'd known it, if the hospital had known it, he wouldn't have been a candidate for transplant.
Wow.
Um,
So it really worked
he
out to your
also,
favor.
yeah, I mean, a mistake worked out in our favor. A pandemic worked out in our favor. We forget that 4 years ago, um, if you were not feeling well and you drove through a parking lot and you stopped and you let someone tickle your brain with a cotton swab, it took 3 or 4 days before you got results back. So the only people who were being taken into an OR were people who were at risk of dying from a car accident or a gunshot wound or needing an organ transplant. They weren't calling and saying, hey, we've got a kidney for your mom and bring her into the hospital now. Mom had to already be in the hospital and be so sick that she was dying
Very true.
if a kidney became available. So we would, if Ben had stayed home, if his kidneys hadn't failed, he would have died at home that spring.
Wow.
Mm.
What let's talk about you and Ben's relationship, if you don't mind. How did your relationship with him evolve through that experience, related and, on my way back to you? And how did you guys go from, I'll say pre-COVID life and everything for you, what that all entailed, the transplant, the broken hip. How did you guys regain your normalcy?
Slowly. Over the course of his autoimmune, I mean, Ben has always been one who, when we get in the car to drive someplace for a 3-hour drive, a 6-hour drive, he's behind the wheel unless he's going to sleep. That's just the way he's always done it. And I found over the course of his many doctor's appointments over the course of those 3 years that more and more often it was me. And then when we would make our semi-annual shift from northern latitudes to southern latitudes as snowbirds, more and more often I was, of the 21-hour drive, I was doing 17 or 18 of them. That's just a sample of how the rest of our lives were shifting as well. I didn't take over the checkbook until he was in the hospital, but we had spent time. One of the advantages we had as he was getting sicker was we had time to be honest with each other about where this was probably heading. And as much as I was caring for Ben, he was doing his best to care for me. And he would say, what scares you about life without me? And then we'd talk through it. And I would say, handling the insurance, handling all the bills, handling closing the one house down as I moved to the other house for 4 or 5 months. And I actually had a cheat sheet that he and I had put together over the course of many months that told me, he even told me when I was going to have to start thinking about Medicare. In January of whatever year, you're going to have to start looking into Medicare. Your birthday's not until May, but you're going to need to be paying attention and figuring this out. The kind of hit me on the head thing about when that check engine light goes on the dashboard, you need to call somebody. There's not going to be a bell. The mechanic is not going to call you. Those kinds of things. He was working on educating and caregiving for me, which was and
Did that make it more overwhelming though? Because now he might be bringing up all kinds of things you hadn't been thinking about.
Parts of it were overwhelming. There were times when I hesitated to go into his office and say, okay, how do I pay this bill? Because I knew he was going to go into something about, oh, that's in this folder and that gets into cost benefit analysis and you need to be thinking about the tax implications of thus and such. And I finally came up with a shorthand, which was, I'm not here for a Russian grammar lesson. I just need to know the Russian word for how do I pay this bill?
Yeah.
Oh, it's the green checkbook. Thank you. And do I mail it or do I do it online? It's online, whatever. And it was a process for both of us. It was a process for him to have to let go of some of those things that he'd been handling for years. Over the course of decades of raising a family, the family chores get divided, and in our lives, they got divided in a fairly traditional way. He handled the money and I handled the groceries and the laundry and Christmas and birthdays. And we got a little bit more flexible about who handled what, especially as he couldn't move around as much anymore. He was handling a little bit more of he could move around enough to do laundry, fold laundry, those kinds of things. He could write birthday cards. He could address Christmas envelopes. So we got a little bit more flexible all the way around. And we got, in the end of things, after all was said and done, we got a little bit more patient with each other. Nowadays, when we get snippy, he comes home with a broken hip. He is home for 2 months before he's strong enough to go back in, and everyone's healthy enough. The COVID numbers in Florida dictated that we couldn't get the hip replaced for 2 months after he got home. And so he was dependent on painkillers. He was going to need to learn how to walk again. There were a lot of things that we endured in the summer of 2020 and the fall of 2020. But after all was said and done, and he starts going to physical therapy, 1 week he's working on things with his walker. A couple weeks later, he's finally on a cane. Then he's learning how to go up the stairs one step at a time, up with the good, follow with the bad, up with the good, follow with the bad. And the day he comes home from physical therapy and goes, look at this. And he walks over to the stairs and goes, look at me doing reciprocal steps. It's one. And now when we get snippy with each other, if one of us stops and takes a breath and kind of realizes this is ridiculous, hey, look at me doing reciprocal steps. It just cuts it all back down to lets all the pressure out of the situation of, okay, so we don't agree on whether or not we're going to this party or not, or whatever, or we don't agree on what we're going to do with the company who's coming next weekend. But in the scheme of things,
Right.
we don't need to retreat to our separate corners. We can.
Puts it all into perspective.
Yeah.
Would when you kind of take inventory of the past 4 years, we'll say, when you look at your community of friends and maybe Ben's coworkers or whatever the case may be, were you surprised, either good or bad, by the support you guys received, or how was the support that you received?
The support was overwhelmingly wonderful. I was on my own in the house. It was just me and the dog, because I kept hoping that the hospital would relax their protocols, especially, well, before and after the transplant, when things were really dark. And I wanted to at least have a compassionate visit, which I should have realized with all the news about all the people whose loved ones were in the hospital dying and couldn't have someone by their side. Wasn't going to happen. But I tried to keep hope alive on that front. So I wasn't going to have dinner with people, or I would go on walks with people if we were 10 feet apart, kind of thing. But I would go on a walk myself, and I would come home and there'd be flowers sitting on my doorstep. Or sometimes if someone knew that I'd been out of the house, I would walk in and dinner was waiting for me on my kitchen table. The cards and letters, the Zoom opportunities, our children were spread all across the country. So I was Zooming with them on a regular basis. I was in touch with them on a regular basis more than we had been in years. Not that we were out of touch, but to talk with them twice a week, a bunch of young men in their 30s talking to their mom twice a week, that doesn't happen, except it was happening then. My book group, we raised our boys in Ohio, and my Ohio book group got in touch with me and said, hey, we're meeting by Zoom. Do you want to sign up with us again? So I had them. I had all the women who'd been on the same floor freshman year in college. We were Zooming together once every 2 weeks. Ben's college roommates were Zooming with me every 10 days. The support was amazing.
Incredible.
It got a little bit challenging after he got the heart, and I sent out an email after he got out of surgery to, I think there were more than 200 people on the email, of here's what's just happened. And the people who responded, because in the middle of April of 2020, things had been so dark, people had been isolated for so long, that the response of this is the best news I've had since the pandemic was declared, that was amazing. I was astounded at how many people reached back out. It was just overwhelming and uplifting and miraculous.
That's wonderful. And it just makes me so happy to hear that answer, because it wasn't the answer I truly expected. I thought there'd be some good, but what we find so often, Sarah, and maybe you can relate to this in some way, because, you and Ben were a younger couple, and to be thrust into this, medical matrix, if you will, a lot of times your peers may not have any experience or anything to relate to on that level where they can say, how's it going? But for them to say that and you to answer, even though you tell them, they can't truly understand it because they're not going through it yet. And hopefully none of them will ever have to. So, I mean, that you have an incredible group of support and community. And I think that's amazing. I want to briefly just touch on your children really quick, because I have 3 younger children. None of them are teenagers. They're first grade, 4th grade, and 6th grade. And, and kind of with the whole community thing and their understanding and support of you, I tell people being a family caregiver sometimes is like expecting a baby. When my wife and I, when we were expecting our first child, everybody told us how amazing it was, how wonderful it was. And yeah, I understand how great and amazing and what a time of life that is for people. But it's not until the baby's delivered do you truly understand what the people are telling you. And I say for a family caregiver, that's often the same way. You can tell your friends and your peers what you're going through and what you're experiencing. But just like they can't know until that baby's born, they can't know truly until they have to be that family caregiver. So to have that kind of support, I'm sure you do count yourself as very blessed, because that's remarkable.
We were so lucky that way. And I do talk about caregiving as being, at least in my situation, because it started relatively slowly with his initial diagnosis of the autoimmune, as like being pregnant.
Okay.
They tell you you're pregnant, and it's like, okay, I feel a little queasy in the morning, but it doesn't really change anything for a while. And when it starts to change things, it changes them subtly to start. And then you get to a point where, oh my goodness, the only way I'm going to come out of where I am right now, 9.5 months pregnant, is if you'd described it to me 10 months ago, I would have said, no, that's not happening. And you get to a point where you're like, okay, I'm ready for this to happen. I'm ready to go through whatever I have to go through to get to the next step. And then you have a baby. Like you're saying, you're now you have the baby, and that's a whole nother set of lessons and a whole nother learning curve. So I've described caregiving in my instance, I didn't have to start doing it overnight. That said, when he came home from the hospital in a wheelchair, after I'd been on my own for 10 weeks, and after he had for 10 weeks had the undivided attention of tens of medical personnel, janitorial staff, technicians, nutritionists, 3 hot meals a day, suddenly it was just me. And that was a 0 to 60 moment, where I was with some pylons on the road.
Yeah.
So that was a learning experience. You asked about support. The one place where we had a glitch was in that window with the home health care. And that was partly COVID, partly where we live in the Keys is isolated. And that was extremely challenging and frustrating. But we got through it. And when I go back and look now at really how long that period was, I think it was probably only a period of 10 days, but those 10 days were really long days and really scary days for me.
Well, and
So,
later when we're off the call, I'll give you some insight as to why that might have been, regardless of where you lived at. But just real briefly before we move on, Sarah, author of On My Way Back to You, your children, your sons, how were
yes.
they? As a mother, I'm sure you're also concerned about them because of their dad. Like how were they? How did they handle it and process it?
Some of them handled it better than others.
Hmm.
But overall, they were great. Um, our youngest son was engaged to be married the first weekend in May of 2020. So he was going through a whole, what are we going to do? We need to reevaluate. Do we do this? We don't do this? So he had a lot on his plate. And in the end, well, by mid-February, they were beginning to talk about putting it off. And certainly when the pandemic was declared, they said, let's put this off for a year. As it turns out, they then did go on the date that had been on the calendar for a year and a half to their minister's house because they knew she wasn't doing anything else, and they did get married. When they drove away from her house, they came around the corner, and friends of theirs that they had shared this news with, or this decision with, well, let's stop for a minute. They had their dog was their best man, and their cat was their maid of honor. So they've got the cat and the dog in the car. They come around the corner, and their friends threw a surprise wedding reception for them. Popped a couple bottles of champagne, and so that's how our youngest son, he handled it by continuing to move forward. Our third son had a life-threatening situation a couple years earlier, where he actually had to learn how to walk again himself. So he was remarkably helpful and supportive in terms of, Mom, when he comes home from the hospital, when he comes home from rehab, he's not going to feel up to doing thus and such. You might want to consider having this for him by the commode in the bathroom. I mean, those kinds of really practical things. And when Ben was getting frustrated with his back, his hip, and not being able to walk, that son was really sympathetic and understanding. And his advice of be patient with yourself, be kind to yourself, meant more because we knew what he was talking about. Our second son, long before Ben ended up in the hospital, but the systemic sclerosis was progressing in a way that made it obvious that Dad wasn't going to be around for a long time. Made a point of trying to harvest memories. When we were north, he'd go. Ben loves to be out in the woods, and that son would be here to take Ben out in the woods because he knew I'd be nervous about Ben being out there alone. And they'd go stalking deer or looking for birds. And so he made a point of harvesting all these memories. And then after Ben got better, that son was quite frustrated. It was like, I know this doesn't make sense, but I'm mad. I was saying goodbye, and now he shows up and he's doing fine. So I think he's worked through those things now, but I was surprised when I learned that that's where his head was. And our oldest son, similar to our youngest son, was in the middle of a really full life. He has 4 children. He and his wife each have careers, and suddenly the pandemic meant that these 6 people were all under the same roof, spending a lot of time together. And so he was processing all of that while processing, they're up in northwestern Massachusetts, and Mom and Dad are down in the Keys, and Dad is dying. How do you balance the moment-to-moment stresses of dealing with 4 children and making sure that the older kids are doing their Zoom classes online and making sure you're getting your work done via Zoom online, and the 2-year-old is really displeased that everybody's home, and the dogs are going a little crazy. And oh, yeah, that's right, Mom and Dad are down in the Keys, and Dad is dying.
Yeah.
It was stressful. So, and they talked with each other. That I really, in retrospect, deeply appreciate. I mean, they grew up close, but life takes you in different directions. They have very different careers, but they started to tag team with each other of, have you talked to mom and dad lately? Has dad called and asked how things are in your bunker? Which was when Ben was extremely loopy, post-transplant. And the doctors would talk about ICU delirium and his compromised mentation, and we're not sure if maybe he's had a stroke. I mean, those kinds of conversations, and the boys wouldn't necessarily bring their fears about that to me. They would talk amongst themselves about it, and they are of an age where they have friends and classmates and peers who have just come through medical school or whatever, and they would call them and bounce those concerns off of them. And
when they had their own little support group amongst each other. Yeah. That's wonderful.
So very grateful for that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just going to say this again, Sarah, and I can't stress how seriously I mean this, how fortunate you and your family were. I mean, we talked to hundreds, if not thousands of people. And I mean, other than the scariness and, what you had to go through and live through, and likewise with Ben and your kids, I mean, I don't think you could have written it any better than how it went.
No, especially, considering the crap we had to go through.
And in the middle of a worldwide pandemic on top of it.
Yeah. We pinch ourselves all the time. And that a family in what has to have been their darkest hours made the incredibly, miraculously generous decision to donate those organs. And I gather from the doctors that at least 4 other families benefited from.
It's wonderful.
It just blows my mind. And we've written a letter and it's been delivered, and we've never heard anything back. And I get that, that the heartbreak that they went through, and I don't want to extend their heartbreak by making them respond to us. But I just this past week had a woman that I've known for 2 or 3 years. But we've been in Florida. She's been in Pennsylvania. She pulled me aside because she was reading the book, and she said, I don't think you know that my son died many years ago. And we went through the donation process. And that, to me, was the part of the full circle that I've been waiting for. It gave me chills, and I know she and I will talk about it more. That was not the moment for us to talk about it. We were in a room with 40 other people, and it was just an aside. But the full circle moment of that is going to take me some time to process, and I'm looking forward to working through it with her sometime soon.
Yeah, no, it's remarkable. Organ donation is, I'm a big proponent of it. It can benefit and touch so many lives just by one person, making that decision. That's for sure.
And one of Ben's college roommates is a transplant surgeon, a heart guy. And for him to go through this with us, Ben was best man in his wedding. He thinks of Ben as his brother. And he has come through all of it and said, I've been doing this for years. I've done hundreds of transplants. I know that heart transplant has, from human to human, has been around for 50 years. But to realize that for the patient and for the patient's family and for the patient's friends, here I am in that position as a patient's friend. It is a miraculous game changer. And it was to watch him go through that transformation. He forgets it every once in a while, and it's kind of, I have to give him one of those look at you doing reciprocal steps kind of nudge of, I know you're the guy who walks in and you're the doctor and you get to do all this stuff. You need to remember that on the other side of the equation, there is a patient and a family and their friends for whom this is miraculous.
Yeah, absolutely. And 100%. Just a couple more questions, Sarah, and thank you again so much for your time. And I cannot stress how much we recommend the book On My Way Back to You. It's a story that I think has a lot of lessons and a lot of redeeming qualities that goes beyond just your story and Ben's story. And it could benefit people, I think, in any situation in life right now. But my question is, one, Have the boys read the book?
The boys have read parts of it. So actually, the youngest son has read it all the way through. I think the oldest son has read it all the way. I think the only one who hasn't is our third son, and he's actually not featured. There are shadowed comments from the sons throughout the book, scattered throughout the book, and that idea came from Glenn Plaskin, who helped me take what was a very raw manuscript and smooth it out, fill in some blanks, cancel out some of the repetition. And Glenn had said to me, we need Ben's voice in here. We need your son's voices in here. And so he reached out to the boys, and our third son opted not to participate. He didn't want to go there. It was a little bit of PTSD. Sure. However, our third son is the one that I quoted the most, actually, in the body of the book. He was the one I've said earlier who'd been through a life-threatening situation where he'd had to learn to walk again. He was the one who would say things to us that opened our heads up. And Ben had thought 4 months after his transplant that we were going to rent an RV and we were going to drive up to Pennsylvania from Florida and we were going to do this and we were going to do that. And I'm saying that we is going to be me. And I'm not confident that I can drive an RV. I might be able to drive an RV forward into a parking lot, but if someone parks in front of us and then need to reverse, I don't want to do this. And I don't want to leave our cocoon where I know how to get groceries right now. I know where to take you if we have a medical emergency. I don't want to be on the road. And Ben was not hearing it from me. But when our son called and said, Dad, what are you thinking? Are you willing to have us come out of our COVID safe cocoons to see you? And if one of us gets sick and ends up having severe medical issues, are you willing to live with that? And it was when that son said it that Ben heard it. Until then, I'd been Charlie Brown's teacher. I'd just been wah, wah. But when our son's voice came through strong and clear, and Ben heard it and finally acquiesced and said, okay, we're staying in the Keys. So they read it. I don't think that son will read it, but I'm not going to make him read it.
Of course. Maybe in time, but were any of them giving you any mixed signals on what they thought about it, or were they all very supportive of the book, or Mom, how could you put that in there? Anything like that?
There wasn't the Mom, how could you put that in there pushback. The pushback is more along the lines of
just putting yourself out there.
Yeah, we've gotten through this. This is behind us. Let's move forward. Let's rejoice and celebrate. And so the having to go back and talk about it is a little bit trauma inducing for them. So we try not to. So basically the conversations now are, how are the book sales going? And we don't talk about the content of the book very much.
Did they know you were gonna write it, or did you tell them after you had already written it?
I don't think they were surprised. I told them, I think after there was a manuscript, one of them, I was having trouble getting a printer to work, and I wanted to print out the manuscript so that I could see that, on page 20, I'm repeating the same stuff that I said on page 60, I'm repeating the same stuff I said on page 20. And I was having issues with that. And so, well, what are you working on? I just needed to get it all out. And well, what are you going to do with it? I don't know. Okay. It's one thing to write it. It's another thing to decide to hire a ghostwriter to help smooth the rough edges, and then hire a publisher, and then hire publicists.
Absolutely. Well, my book came out last month, so I absolutely understand that. I wanted to ask you, Ben, the most important person here. How did he read it, and what did he think about you writing it? He
did read it. It took him. He read it in bits and pieces. Every once in a while, I would know he had a copy of it up in his office, and I knew that the bookmark was moving through maybe only 4 pages at a time every 5 or 6 days. Small doses. He needed small doses, but every once in a while, I was pleased to hear him laugh at something, or he'd come downstairs and say, "Wow, I had no idea that that's what you were going through on the other side of things. I mean, it was a battlefield, but we were on separate parts of it,
Sure.
working our way through. And so you ask how he's doing. He he's doing wonderfully. It's miraculous. It's so miraculous that on occasion he annoys me, and it's amazing. I wake up in the middle of the night and he's snoring, and I think that's a beautiful sound.
I was just going to say it's a beautiful sound.
Yeah, my sister lost her husband 25 years ago. My brother died 4 years ago, and I think of my sister and my sister-in-law and what they would give to roll over in the night hearing their husband snore. I know we are blessed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, last question, Sarah. Are there any more books in your future?
There might be a sequel called He's Annoying Me and It's Wonderful. I don't know. Not right away. I will continue to write for local papers and for friends who need editing work done. But right now, I just want to enjoy the gift of time we've been given that we really did not expect to have. Spend more time with our grandchildren and more time with our boys.
Well, and I hope truly that you guys enjoy every single minute of every day. So, Sarah Cart, author of On My Way Back to You, thank you so much for your time today and for just opening yourself up and sharing you and Ben's story with us.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure. Have a great day.
Thank you. Whenever I would share our story with people, someone would inevitably say, "Oh my goodness, you should write a book." And so I did. And at its core, On My Way Back to You is a love story, although a bit gritty. And Ben certainly embarked upon what turns out to have been a tale of the hero's journey, with some unexpected plot twists. But it's also a primer for caregivers and the ones that they care for. So I'd like readers to feel that they got to experience a feel-good story with a happy ending, as well as, if it's applicable for a caregiver and or a patient, some encouraging advice. I have no doubt that some people will think, what do you know? How can you possibly share anything of use for me because you got a happy ending? But we didn't know we were going to get a happy ending, and we spent a lot of time preparing for what was going to be awful as Ben's health deteriorated so precipitously. I tried as best as I could to prepare for how I would move on if things went the other way. And Ben was very encouraging about that, very good about asking me what I was afraid of, helping me figure out how to move through things, encouraging me to say yes to multiple opportunities that came up, invitations to be in organized groups, serve on committees, sit on a board here or there. And the reason was we were constructing a life for me without him. I didn't want to end up sitting in the back of my closet with my thumb in my mouth after he died. And so I worked really hard to be sure that there would be a healthy framework where I'd have to go out and participate in the world beyond my grief, and that would be the best way to honor his memory. So
thank you for joining us today here at All Home Care Matters. All Home Care Matters is here to help families as they navigate these long-term care issues. We invite you to visit us at allhomecarematters.com, where there's a private, secure, fillable form where you can give us feedback, show ideas, or if you have questions. Every form is read and responded to. And remember, you can listen to the show on any of your favorite podcast streaming platforms or watch the show on our official YouTube channel. Just make sure that you hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. We'd also like to say thank you again to Sarah Cart, the author of the book On My Way Back to You. This is a book that we highly recommend you check out. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you next time here at All Home Care Matters.